Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the debate entitled A New Europe 1918, 1923 and 2022. Memory. Can you hear well, or is there any problem? Yeah? Okay. My name is Bartosz Dziewanowski-Stefańczyk, and I'm co-curator of the exhibition After the Great War. The focus of the debate is discussing the similarities of the situation and the challenges or even threats to the new European order around 1918 and currently. Each time when I was doing the guided tour ever since 2018, when we presented the exhibition for the first time in Prague, I could actually relate to the current political, social situation in Europe. I would speak about the problems in Belarus after the presidential elections because we have similar issues that we tackle at the exhibition. I could relate to refugees during the refugee crisis because we also speak about refugees at the exhibition. I could speak about Spanish flu because during the pandemic. And then I could also speak about Ukraine, unfortunately. This brings me to the necessity to compare the situation back in 1918 and today. Oops. I don't want to spoil the debate by saying too much about it. So I will focus now briefly on a book published recently in the series Remembrance and Solidarity, established by Routledge and the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity. This book, which broadens the scope of the exhibition and which we would like to present during this debate. It was edited by Professor J. Winter, who will moderate the debate, and by myself. This set of essays introduces readers to new historical research devoted to the creation of the new order in East Central Europe and the period immediately following 1918. The book offers insights into the political, diplomatic, military, economic, and cultural conditions out of which the new Europe was born. We were successful in bringing together a group of 15 experts from various countries. We tried to give equal attention to both the Western and the Eastern Front while violence continued in multiple forms over the following 5 years, and we show how state building after 1918 in Central and Eastern Europe was marked by a mixture of innovation and instability. Therefore, the volume focuses on narratives related to conflicts and violence, those related to the recasting of civilian life in the new structures and institutions, as well as those related to remembrance and representations of these years in the public sphere. The volume was written shortly before and during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is a proof that in this difficult moment you could actually create something. So it was created at the end of the long centenary, which in Western Europe started in 2014. However, at that time, it was hardly acknowledged in East Central Europe, which shows how different our collective memories are. Then there were centenaries of various battles and of the October Revolution. Again, these were not commemorated in East Central Europe. Rather, the experts would speak about them. In that region, however, celebrations, because that is the word which reflects those, the memory in East Central Europe, started only in 2018. There were various state programs, cultural events, publications, etc. The official remembrance will last until this year or even until 2023 in our region or in most countries. Historians very often use anniversaries to publish. We make living thanks to them. However, the long centenary made it possible for many of researchers not only to publish their books, but also for the public to acknowledge the importance of the centenary and to get more familiar with the events that played out more than 100 years ago. It seems that thanks to the long centenary, we had enough time to think and reflect, and indeed, the gravity of First World War studies has started to shift eastwards And there is more understanding, or at least I hope there is more understanding, that the war did not end in 1918. Our book shows this change, and we hope to bring this fairly new perspective to the global public. It is all the more important as the whole world is watching the events in Eastern Europe right now. Having said that, let me introduce to you the moderator of today's debate and my dear co-editor, Jay Winter, who is the Charles J. Steele Professor of History Emeritus at Yale University. He is one of the most important experts worldwide on the First World War and its impact on the 20th century. Previously, he taught at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the University of Warwick, the University of Cambridge, and Columbia University. He is author or co-author of 25 books. In addition, he has edited or co-edited 30 other books and contributed 130 book chapters. He was also co-producer, co-writer, and chief historian for the PBS-BBC series The Great War and the Shaping of the 20th Century, which won, among others, an Emmy Award. He has received honorary doctorates from the University of Graz, the University of Leuven, and the University of Paris. He is also a member of the Academic Council of the exhibition. Jay, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bartosz. Thank you, everyone, for coming. What I think would be perhaps important and useful is to immediately acknowledge that this exhibition requires us to say that discussions of war and peace in the early 20th century cannot turn away from the parallels with the suffering and killing and crimes committed in Ukraine. We have to start there. It isn't a background issue, it's a foreground issue. It's a central issue of conscience as much as of scholarship. And therefore, there will be, I think, an opportunity for us to engage as scholars with the colleagues on my left and right, and with the audience on issues of whether Vladimir Putin has put the world back to 1917, 18, 19, to the Russian Civil War, to the violence in Ukraine, to the section of the book that Bartosz and I edited on what I call the Second Great War, the war that continued from 1917 and the Russian Revolution to 1923 and the Treaty of Lausanne. Partly this project, the necessity of focusing on Ukraine today, comes from my personal contempt for the historical outlook of Winston Churchill, a man who has, shall we say, a varied press in Ireland. Now, Churchill actually wrote these words. There are many things that Churchill said that many people would prefer to ignore. Let's try this one on. The way he talked about the period was 1918-23, the war of the giants has ended, the war of the pygmies has begun. His racial contempt for Africans is something that he developed lifelong. But the notion that what happened in Eastern Europe is not a continuation of what happened in the First World War is something we historians have taken decades to escape from. So part of the purpose, not only of the book, but also of this discussion, is to talk about a decade of violence, the likes of which the world had never seen before. And to see to what extent 1918 to 1921, or if you will, 23, since that's the last treaty of that period in Lausanne, whether that violence has been more formative and creative in the construction of Europe today than historians have given credit for. And we have to recognize the significance of this period and an understanding of just how cruel and criminal the war that Vladimir Putin launched has been. So the idea that historians don't make moral judgments is one that I've thrown away a long time ago. I'm old enough to do that, I think. But I think there are moral issues on how we interpret the period 1917 to 21, 1918 to 21, and starting with the Russian Revolution, that we need to reflect on. So with that statement of my personal position, which I admit has a personal signature and nothing at all, Bartosz, and I have done a book together, but the interpretation I just presented is mine and mine alone, for those who will criticize it. What I want to do, though, is to draw scholars of West, Central, and Eastern Europe into the conversation about this period, this delicate and complex period. And I'm just simply going to do it in terms of the order. This is your right, my left. On the far left, only in placement, is Professor Robert Gerwarth of the University College Dublin, friend of long standing and scholar of The Vanquished, is, I think, the book that has made the most impact that I've seen it. I must say, Robert, that I was in an airport before the COVID epidemic took off in Lesotho, and your book was there. I just thought you should know that. There it is. Now, on my left, your right, you will see Dr. Olena Palko of Birkbeck College University of London. Now, Dr. Palko is Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Birkbeck College, University of London, and a Junior Research Fellow at the Polish Institute of Advanced Studies in Warsaw. She has produced a very extraordinary set of remarks on making Ukraine Soviet, Literature and Cultural Politics under Lenin and Stalin, which was awarded the prize for the best book in the field of Ukrainian history, politics, language, literature, and culture from the American Association for Ukrainian Studies. Now, on my right, your left, is Jennifer Redmond, and I would like to simply start with the fact that she is president of the Women's History Association of Ireland. She has been president. I'll use the continuous past. Like ambassadors, I think you can use the word president for the rest of your life.
Probably.
And indeed will enable us, I think, to extend this discussion to Ireland. She is the author of Irish Women in the First World War Era, Irish Women's Lives 1418, Moving Histories, Irish Women's Migration to Britain from Independence to Republic. And then on her right, your left, Piotr Juszkiewicz, is that correct?
Excellent, yes. Exactly.
All right. He's an art historian and professor at the Mickiewicz University in Poznań, where he lectures at the Institute of Art History, and his work spans an extraordinary range of the history of art in the 20th century in many different contexts and indeed many different artistic traditions. Now, what I would like to do is first say that what we can make of this conversation is to engage in a matter that I think is difficult to do. It's to try to put ourselves in the first place in the shoes of those coming out of the First World War, literally turning their back on the trenches and on the ugliness of it. The way Reinhard Koselleck divided historical time was between spheres of experience and horizons of expectation. Well, let's just say at the beginning of 1919, January 1st, maybe even December 1st in Ukraine, what was the horizon of expectations of those either ending a period of engagement in war or moving to the unhappy position of seeing war itself mutate into other kinds of violence? Not necessarily only international, but class violence, racial violence, and civil war violence. Now, perhaps it would be wise to start off in Ireland and to talk about the horizon of expectations in Ireland at any point that you would choose, let's say from the beginning of December 1918, early 1919, while the rising had taken place 3 years earlier. What would you say would be the end of the war, or the end of one war, and the germination of another.
Yeah, December 1918 is a very good place to start, actually, because we have an election. And it's the first election that women can vote in, and they do, in large numbers. And it's the first election after the Rising where expectations changed radically. And within 2 years, you had a shift from a belief in constitutional nationalism, a belief in parliament, democracy, a certain belief in the empire as well, and Ireland's role, potential role in it, to literally throwing that out. It's not enough. Anti-monarchy sentiments, anti-British sentiments. It is interesting to have this conversation in these grounds on a site of hatred, I would imagine, for some people, power, certainly. And there are reports in the newspaper at the time of the armistice and just afterwards of clashes between ordinary citizens who were waving Union Jacks and happy that the war was over, maybe anticipating the return of their relatives who had gone to war for various different reasons, and Sinn Féin supporters ripping up their flags, clashing with British police, and, well, when you say British police, that's actually not correct, many of them were Irish, but certainly the British Crown Forces, and retaliation as well. Wrecking of Sinn Féin headquarters in Harcourt Street by British soldiers. So already small-scale skirmishes, violence on the streets between ordinary people was happening right at the end of supposedly the Great War. So the expectations, I think, were so fluid that it was all to play for, but certainly turning against, almost wanting to willingly forget about the war immediately, because the priority then was a republic for so many people.
Was this a British military garrison at where we're sitting at the time? We're in the belly of the whale. This is where the British Empire...
One of the main sites of power within Dublin city centre. You know, we're not too far from another one, Dublin Castle. And yeah, so it's a very interesting place to have this conversation.
I wonder what the British soldiers' expectations were too, because obviously there were those who felt they won the war.
Exactly, yeah.
I think of that work of genius, The Steward of Christendom, as an example of how a particular policeman, an Irish policeman, went mad because of Irish history at the time. The stability or instability, I think, is a subject that we need to perhaps turn to, shall we call it Lviv or Kyiv? I want to make the correct distinctions of names. What about December 1918 in Ukraine? Expectations, what kind of future was thinkable, possible?
If you allow me, I would perhaps refer to the date 22nd of January 1919. This was the day of unification when Ukrainian People's Republic and Western Ukrainian People's Republic announced unification. And this is a very important date in the memory of today's Ukraine, right? Because this is a reference to the unification of two different parts of Ukraine, finally or for the first time joining together. And if we kind of go back a little bit in history, I wanted to say that Ukrainians started the war in 1914 torn between two different empires, right? There was Eastern Galicia that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and there was the Dnieper Ukraine, which was part of the Russian Empire. So Ukrainians actually fought against each other. And this is this is something that we historians, or myself as a historian of Soviet Ukraine, tend to forget, that there were also Ukrainians on the other side of the border. And if we think about 1919, we again have Ukrainians split by the new borders. We have Poland, and we have Ukrainian People's Republic, and then Soviet Ukraine. So across this period, we have this problem of divided nation. The nation, and if we kind of turn now to expectations, right? This is why this date, 22nd January, is so important, because this was for the first time when those people, Ukrainians, across the border, sort of declared their unity and their intention to be together. And if we kind of think about other expectations, this was definitely this idea of self-determination, the keyword, the buzzword of post-war period. Ukrainians wanted to self-determination. Ukrainian delegation went to Paris. It was not recognized because other kind of more powerful states, those states that the international community saw as more viable states. Poland was recognized, the Ukrainians were not. So delegation was there, they did come to the international community, they did show their maps, and that's why I really love the exhibition when we see the maps and the claimed borders, right? Ukrainian delegation also claimed their borders, and it clashed very much with what Poles saw as their homeland, right? So the demands of Ukrainian delegation were not heard. Same, there was a delegation of Western Ukrainian People's Republic. Their demands were not heard. So we have a lot of expectations, but at the same time, I think also frustration. Yeah. And also, if I refer back to this 22nd of January 1919, on the one hand, we have unification, but on the other hand, we have those two governments fighting against far bigger, we can say enemies, we can say rivals. The Ukrainian People's Republic was at war with the Bolshevik Russia. Or we can say that the Soviet Ukrainian government that was formed earlier in already 1917, actually. And if we think about Western Ukrainian People's Republic, they were at war with Poland, right? And this is where we can refer back to Lviv or Lviv at the time. So we really have this, the context of a divided, not yet a nation, but an ethnic group that wants to be together, that wants self-determination, yet is frustrated because they cannot do it. First, because the international community does not recognize it, and second, because they are at war with larger powers.
Is the frustration, and I use the word that you use, the source or one of the sources of the efflorescence of anti-Semitic violence in Ukraine in 1919? And if so, how did it play out?
This is a very good question, and so for my current project, I actually look at minorities, and obviously anti-Semitism and inter-ethnic violence, this is something that pops up all the time, right, throughout Ukraine's history. And I think frustration might be a good word because of this association between Jews and communists, right, between kind of Jews as not supporting the national government, we can say the Ukrainian People's Republic, like it's often been referred to as nationalist government, although most of their members were really kind of socialist, yes. So left-leaning. And I think there was a lot of these misunderstandings, but also coupled with a long history of discrimination of Ukrainians. And if we think in the context of Poland, right, Ukrainians were discriminated for a very long time, same as they were in the Russian Empire, right? There was a lot of assimilation, there was a lot of bans on Ukrainian language and so on and so on. So I think we have this moment of, again, this expectation of national revival, yes. Or not even revival, kind of the idea that the nation would become possible, and at the same time, a lot of fear that, you know, there are kind of external challenges that would not allow it. And then you have this, like, I would call it frustration that kind of spilled out and
found scapegoats.
Yes.
I see. Robert, can I draw you into this? We needn't use biography necessarily, but perhaps you could say, what did Heydrich think 1919 was going to do to his life as a young man?
Oh yeah, I think he had a very different career trajectory in mind at this point. He's from a very musical family, and his grandfather owned a very famous conservatory in Saxony, and his father was a very well-known opera singer and also owner of a conservatory in the city of Halle. So I think his career trajectory at this point would have been to become, at some point, the heir of this family business. But at the same time, of course, many middle-class Germans at the time were radicalized by the experience of defeat in particular. Like him, many of them joined sort of paramilitary organizations in the aftermath of the First World War, became much more radicalized by politics, without saying that 1933 is the necessary outcome of this crisis of German political and social identity. So I think obviously 1918 and the crisis of the following years leads to a reconfiguration of biographies in a major way, but with very different trajectories. Some people obviously move to the left, others far to the right, and so on and so forth. So it is a sort of major moment in which lives are transformed, not necessarily, not always for the worse, sometimes also, of course, for the better.
I was going to ask you if you have any sympathy with the Peter Lowenberg psychohistory, saying that this is a moment when millions of young men had to deal with the fact that their fathers are not coming home, they're dead, 2 million German soldiers killed, that these young men who have lived without fathers during the war when they were fighting have to deal with the immediate aftermath of war and inflation and complete instability. Is it the case, would you say, that the Spartacus uprising, for example, may have validated for some the Judeo-Bolshevik myth that here Rosa Luxemburg, Liebknecht unfortunately was not Jewish for their purposes, but Rosa was, created precisely the fear that helped to shift their horizon of expectations towards radical action?
Yeah, I think on the extreme right, that would definitely be the case. I mean, the idea of a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy had been pretty much around since Lenin's second Russian Revolution of 1917, and it spread like wildfire, not just in East Central Europe, but all the way to America, for example, where, the idea that the Jews were obviously behind something as subversive as the communist revolution was, had, at least in the ears and minds of some people, some value as an explanation of why it happened when it happened. And of course, it is true that within the upper echelons of the Bolshevik Party, there were a disproportionate number of Jews because they veered towards Bolshevism because of Bolshevism's colorblindness and because they, unlike their opponents, welcomed people from different ethnic groups and different religious backgrounds. So it was seen as a reform movement, and that the same reason is why you have not as many, but a number of Jews in the leading socialist movement in Germany as well. Nonetheless, I think when we talk about the dark side of 1918, it is still important to bear in mind that if you look at the first election results in Germany, there's a strong majority pro-democracy, an overwhelming majority. People welcome initially the end of the war. I think it's over. There's an opportunity for peace and hopefully prosperity, for democracy. It's a moment when 50% of the adult population has the right to vote, which I think is obviously a huge moment in the history of politics. And Germany is one of the first countries in Europe to introduce the female active and passive right to vote. So there are many positive moments as well. So I think we need to emphasize this kind of almost contradictory moment, massive amounts of violence, the fact that for most Europeans, the 11th of November 1918, a date which is of course invested with a lot of meaning in Britain and France in particular, is very much meaningless in large parts of Europe. But at the same time, we have to see that there are also strong kind of positive developments.
This notion of a dialectic between violence and regeneration is what I think we see inscribed in every single part of the exhibition. I wanted to draw Piotr into the conversation. What I thought of when Robert was speaking is, what do we make of Dada? You know, Dada is in some ways a revolt against the mobilization of art and the academy and universities in the murder and destruction of an entire generation. Did Dada actually have any echoes in Poland and Eastern Europe, or was it entirely a Berlin, Zurich, Paris phenomenon?
Yeah, we can say that Dada was important also for the artists from Eastern Europe, but usually it was a combination of Dada, Futurism, and some other artistic movements. But coming back to the problem of expectation and hopes, I would say that the dominating artistic movement was modernism. I would say that Dada was the beginning of the modernism. It stayed at the beginning of the modernism, and in general, modernists dreamt about new world, new art. They were ready to start from the scratch, to build completely new world and new art. And they used the word regenerate. It was very important for the modernism because they wanted to regenerate almost the whole world. And the main goal, their main goal and their main hope was to create, to educate, to raise a new man for the new world, and they hope also that the new man would live in a new space, more safe, closer to nature, hygienic. That's very important. So they really hoped for the new man more perfect and more than contemporary people, from the physical point of view, moral, social, and so on and so on. But if we come again to the eastern part of Europe, 1918 for them it was a very important moment, not so much from the stylistic point of view, but rather from because of the new task to work out a new visual identity. So they very often combined, for example, folk art and modern art to create new artistic, new visual idiom for the new states, like Poland, like Czechoslovakia, like Latvia, for example, and so on. It was very interesting that on the West, it was very well received. The international exhibition in 1925 in Paris was a huge and great success of Polish artists. They received hundreds of medal awards and so on because of this combination, folk art and let's say rigid geometrical art, which remind Cubism, as a new language, new visual language, which is in the same time modern and national. And there was no problem to link one thing with the other. I mean, the national and the modern.
But would that very point, I wonder, would you accept that it's the national profile that distinguishes this effort from the Blauer Reiter, which after all had folk, you know, this is Kandinsky, and all the notion of folklore was transnational in the Blauer Reiter, and in the Poznań, and this is part of the challenge that I think the exhibition shows, that the new configuration of states added to the grammar of artistic innovation and experimentation.
Yes, exactly. Sometimes this tradition, I mean deep historical tradition, was absent, and it can be, could be, and had to be invented, in fact. For Kandinsky, he also used a lot of motifs from Bavarian folk art, but also from the Russian art. So, it was a very important element of modernism in, of course, countries from the Eastern Europe, but it's parallel to, let's say, primitivism on the West. These countries from the East didn't have a colonial experience, so they seek, in fact, and were looking for deep tradition in folk art, sometimes in the art of the children, and so on and so, to gain something authentic, valuable, and so on and so on.
Yes, indeed. Well, one of the things that we need to do, and I'm very glad that we can talk about this, is to try to ungender art history and cultural history, and to talk about how women's contribution to the reconfiguring of the world may have complicated and multiplied the dimensions. I'm thinking of Katie Kollwitz, for example, and her lifetime search for a language to express the loss of her son, who was killed in 1914. But I wonder if you'd say that the period 1918 to 21 in Ireland was a creative moment for Irish women. What would you say to that?
Gosh, it's very tricky. Very tricky.
Everything in Irish history is tricky.
I know. I know. I tell my students all the time, we're not that exceptional. Stop saying like, oh, this is tricky now. So we have a moment when some women get the vote in 1918, and we move quickly to all women just based on age, same as men, get the vote in 1922, and it seems like we're going great. And then we are not so much, because one of the most treasured parts of the Irish Revolution, happening at the same moment as the end of the Great War, is a reassertion of quite traditional values and a skepticism towards modernism, actually, in that those are foreign influences, and now is our chance to assert more nationalistic traditional values. And unfortunately, women are sacrificed to that notion. And there's an exhibition right now on the second floor reflecting on Magdalen laundries, which are the places where unwanted women, often pregnant outside of marriage, sometimes as a result of assault, were put by their own families. So this isn't a state or church bogeyman narrative. This was regarded as an appropriate thing to do for people who had transgressed too far, never mind if they had been transgressed against. So we have a moment where there are lots of fabulous women making noise, making headlines across the world. Countess Markievicz is our first TD and cabinet minister, second in the world to be a female cabinet minister. But the legislation that puts women in their place comes very fast. I mean, the government are scrambling, like many other states across Europe, to put in place an architecture to create a new state. Lots of things they have to do. And one of the very first is to put a marriage bar in the civil service so that women have to leave very quickly. They also prevent women from taking exams to progress up the grades. So this means that women's voices are not there in the room and haven't been there since, essentially.
Well, I wonder whether Ukraine is an exception. Was there room for the development of artistic and cultural life for Ukrainian women in the period 18 to 21? I'm thinking the Russian parallel, with Chagall, Vitebsk, and these wonderful moments until they got stamped out, by the party. Was this also a moment of artistic creativity in the history of Ukraine?
Oh, well, definitely. Actually, it's maybe as an anecdote. Now I'm currently based in Warsaw, and the Polish government acquired 14 paintings by Chagall, right? And now they are in the National Museum in Warsaw. And I went there with my sister, who was forced to leave Kyiv, and we went there, and there was a tour. And actually, a woman said that this is the Russian painter, right? Because he was kind of in Russia. And my sister was asking me, but why don't they say that he's Belarusian? Vitebsk is in Belarus. And I'm like, and I asked my sister, why wouldn't they say that he's a Jewish painter? Because, you know, so, and I think this anecdote is really very appropriate to understand this particular moment of 1919, 1920, just the end of empires, the rise of new nation states. Who were those people, right? And like, where did they belong, right? Whose part of cultural heritage they are? But actually, if we speak about artistic creativity, this was the end of the revolution was really a period of a huge spark in artistic creativity. And this is what Piotr already said. One of the reasons was this creative combination of old and new. Yeah. We still have modernism. We can say that it's old modernism because it started at the beginning of the 20th century. But at the same time, there is futurism. There is revolutionary proletarian art, which we shouldn't forget, right? Because the October Revolution, it really gave a spark to huge amount of also artistic expectation, right? For liberation, for kind of art that would transcend borders. And we see also a lot of artists who were joined the Bolshevik Party, who supported the revolution, and kind of by trying to create something new. So actually, if we think about Ukraine, and this is what also one of the problems is in the challenge of decolonizing, yes. Right? The Russian Russian art, because when we see a lot of kind of what we call Russian avant-gardists, many of them were active in Ukraine, yes. Were born in Ukraine, and so on and so on. So it is indeed, we can say that these are it's a parallel process to what was going yes. on in Russia, yeah. But at the same time, what Piotr was saying, these people were looking for kind of not recreating, they were constructing the past, the tradition, the history, yes. And this is in this combination with kind of a lot of also primitivism and so on and so on. Yeah. So it's incredibly rich period yes. In Ukrainian art.
It would be, I think most of us would agree that polyvocality is the answer to the stupid distinctions between one form of art. What is Yitzhak Bavel? Is the Red Guard a Ukrainian work of art or a Russian work of art? It's a human work of art. It's got humanism written all over it, whatever his sad future. But the idea that artists wrote and created and sculpted from multiple points of view, not from only one angle, is clearly something that we can see time again. I was going to ask you, Robert, could you say a few words about what were the origins of the Bauhaus? There's an extraordinary multi-national phenomenon. Where does it come from?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with general criticism within artistic circles broadly defined of the stuffiness of imperial Germany, and a turn away from the kind of more ornate style, and to try and find radical new answers to radically changed times. So obviously the Bauhaus movement then sort of explodes in the 1920s, sort of becomes, I think, what in America is called international style, with a rejection of the world of yesterday that Zweig still hangs on for very different reasons, because it was better as a Jew to live in a multinational, as he would put it, multinational empire with the legal securities afforded by Austria-Hungary than in a post-imperial nation state, which tries to exclude minorities. But for the Bauhaus, I think it's the like for many artistic movements, I think the crisis provides an opportunity. In the same way, I mean, if you want to relate it to modern times, the pandemic has led to a marked increase in productivity of books, for example, which I didn't expect in some ways, but you're a living proof, Jay. Not only have you published this wonderful book, but I also am aware of 2 other book projects that you managed to finish. So I think in some cases it's that kind of energy of crisis, which translates into...
Did the Bauhaus inspire a rethinking of the boundaries between the artisan and the artist in Eastern Europe as well?
Yes, we can say that, but for the Bauhaus, one thing is important, that they also relate on tradition. For Gropius, Middle Ages was the peak of artistic, let's say, craftsmanship.
It's a mixture of art and artistry.
Yes, exactly. And for him, workshops from the Middle Ages was the pattern how artists should cooperate with one another. So even in such cases like Bauhaus, deep artistic past was very important.
Yes.
Like for Mihailo Bojczuk from the Ukraine, who tried to recreate traditional icon painting. And many artists from Poland, many women artists from Poland were active in his school. He was known in Paris, he studied in Krakow, so it was really complicated relationships of different patterns of nationality, different patterns of artistic past tradition, and so on and so on. Really fruitful time.
Would you say that some early Bolshevik, I won't call it Soviet yet until 1922, some early, shall we say, liberal approaches to the freedom of art in the Bolshevik Russia was attractive to artists in other parts of Eastern Europe. We've not talked about what I would call the moment before the Russian Revolution froze into the ice of the Stalinist period. But we need to do justice to the fact that expectations of what the Russian Revolution would be were varied and multiple. And I would imagine among artists as well. I know that to be true in France. I wonder whether it was true elsewhere in Eastern Europe.
Sure, Russian avant-garde was attractive not only for artists from Eastern Europe, but they cooperate. For example, the constructivist movement in Poland was very strong, and Władysław Strzemiński cooperated with Malevich, with Rodchenko, Tatlin, and so on, because Strzemiński was an officer of Russian army. And he was wounded, and after that he resigned, of course, and he became an artist. So yes, it was strong cooperation. Moreover, because Russian avant-garde created, let's say, general utopias, where new men about whom I talked earlier was the main goal of art, of new space. They tried to build completely different structures than old capitalist cities. I mean, linear structure with a special function for everyone, and so on and so on. So they really tried to realize their artistic utopias.
Yes, we have a chapter in the book that Bartosz and I edited by Helmut Conrad especially on Vienna, and the what I would call the urban politics of modernism in designing
yes,
the living spaces of the working class population, and not only there. Well, I would like to see if we can go to a third part of our conversation about parallels between then and now. But before that, I think it would be wise to ask if anyone in the audience has a question on what we've talked about so far. We're going to talk about Ukraine. At least I'm going to talk about Ukraine. But are there others who want to have a look at the issues related to the first two parts of our conversation? Much better, I think, now than to wait till the end when everyone's tired. Who would like to ask a question?
I'd like to ask.
Please.
So I was thinking about the loss of all those hundreds of thousands of young men during the First World War and the impact of that. Sorry. Just the impact of that in the period that you're talking about, and the impact of that on women who lost mainly breadwinners.
Sons.
And sons, and
Others.
and also the impact on the sons that were left, in terms of having maybe no father. And is there any connection between that then and the Second World War,
Well,
that loss?
We talked about it briefly. Let me see if I can open a conversation about this in two directions. First is that one of the convictions that I spent years trying to persuade other people to believe is that what the First World War did was not only create extraordinary impulse towards modernism, but an equal and opposite movement back towards romantic, religious, and classical art. And the most specific location of such turnings back are war memorials. With Robert's colleague John Horn, Robert and John have been immensely important in creating the historiography of the period 1918 to 21. This must be 30 years ago when I visited John to take a look at the war memorial that Edmund Lutyens created in Dublin. The problem was it was covered by grass where only horses grazed. This is before the moment when the First World War became a reality in Irish commemoration. It wasn't possible to admit it. And the claim I make is that when people mourned in public, they did so at very local memorial sites that mattered because that's where their sons or husbands or brothers went to. And when people designed them, they didn't use modernist tradition because modernism is wonderful, it's disturbing, exciting, challenging, but it doesn't help people mourn. That's the claim I did 25 years ago. I still haven't persuaded most of my colleagues, I think, about it, but it's the other side, I think, of the artistic legacy of mass death, which is a return to what I would call older forms. And you know, I agree entirely that the distinction between old and new is silly. It's not necessary. We don't need to go that way. But one of the things that matters, I think, is 1918 to 21 is a period of the recognition of mass death as a reality in the lives of most, I'm not sure if I can say most families, but a very large proportion of the families of Europe, East and West. The problem is, in East, it got truncated. In Russia, in particular, 2 million dead soldiers. The revolution demanded year zero be 1917. So this issue which you raise is just as true, you know, for Petrograd, St. Petersburg, as it was for Paris. But no one picked it up. But you know, how did families, for example, Anne Dolan, my student, has written beautifully about, you know, the what would you call it, the cult of death in early.
Yeah,
early
glorification of
national
violence.
Ireland. Would you use that word? Is that too hard a phrase?
No, not if you look at the words of the nationalist leaders themselves who talk about blood sacrifice, etc. There's a wonderful book called Singled Out, which talks about that generation of women who had no one to marry, and all sorts of consequences, though, about that. I mean, it accelerates women's entry into the workforce, but it has to have had, I mean, some might claim an even generational impact and trauma, especially, I think, in places like this, where we couldn't seem to actually say it. And that there are war memorials in churches. For example, Willie Redmond is memorialized in a church, a beautiful church in Wicklow. But it's like it's there, but it's not there, or we can't see it. I think that must have been incredibly painful, I have to say.
I wonder about in Poland, you know, the necessity of creating cemeteries for the dead was there everywhere, all over the place. The problem was that these people died for a state that was no longer in existence. And the creation had to be done in a state that hadn't fought in the war as such. had clearly had, the Nationals had done so.
But,
What
you
would
know,
you say about the business of commemorative art?
I'm not sure, because first of all, I'm just humble art historian, not political historian or social historian. But it seems to me that in Poland the situation was slightly different. I mean, first of all, that regaining independence was so important. It was so important for people, for artists, for writers, and so on and so on. That probably the problem of sacrifice wasn't so, let's say, big, something like that. And besides, in Poland there was a long tradition of constant uprising from 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and blood for fatherland was something usual, I would say, for young Polish people. So maybe this is the difference. But as I said,
There is a point that I'd like to draw you out on that absolutely amazed me. Is the existence in the municipal cemetery in Lviv of two monuments for the unknown warrior of the war between Poland and Ukraine. And of course, the unknown warrior of Poland could have been the man who killed the unknown warrior of Ukraine. So their proximity in my visit was shocking. I don't know anywhere else in the world where there are two monuments to unknown soldiers on two sides of the same civil war. You know, it's as if, you know, in Arlington National Cemetery, Southerners are excluded in the American Great National Monument, as if there would be a Southern soldier facing a Northern one. How do you take that present politics of commemoration in Lviv, in that cemetery? And it brings us as a bridge to our third subject. There are the graves in the same cemetery of Ukrainian soldiers who died in 2014, next to the graves of those who died in the Galicia division of the SS in the Second World War, as if it's the same struggle. I'm not for a moment going Putin's way, believe me, but the geography of that cemetery brings them together. How do you respond to that?
Well, what I can say that the example of Lviv, this is of course a very recent phenomenon, right? And this is, I guess, a result of a huge work, diplomatic work between Ukraine and Poland.
Yes.
And I haven't worked with this topic, right? But I would say that this reconciliation was possible only because there are questions which were not discussed, or which the governments don't want to discuss. So by agreeing on, you know, those victims
Yes.
of 1919,
Yes.
we don't speak about the victims of Volhynia massacre, we don't speak about the Second World War, we don't speak about SS Halichina, and so on and so on. So I think it's as if a diplomatic compromise. And this is, I mean, I would say, again, this is kind of like, I don't know whether it's really kind of what happened, right, in this dialogue, but at some point, by we I mean the Ukrainian government or the Ukrainian nation, we are ready to agree on something, but not on other things.
Of course. Well, that's very persuasive. Just to bring it, I suppose, back to the current moment. Robert, how would you respond to the claim that the fighting going on now in the east of Ukraine is very similar to, not identical to, but very similar to the fighting that happened in 1919, 1920?
Well, there is, I think, something quite persuasive about it, and I feel often when we talk about the past and its importance for this particular conflict that is unfolding in Ukraine at the moment, we're often talking about the wrong wars. We're often talking about the 1990s and, you know, what has been done right and what has been done wrong and who has made what promises, or we're talking about the Second World War. But we rarely ever talk about the First World War and particularly its bloody aftermath, which of course brings the first Ukrainian independence in this period, which sees conflicts, you know, attempts. We could talk about, you know, the trauma of this period for the Ottoman Empire, the Sèvres complex, but no one's talking about the, you know, in relation to Putin, about the Brest-Litovsk complex and the attempts of subsequent Russian regimes to retake that territory that was lost as a result of Brest-Litovsk. And I think in terms of the fighting that we're seeing, there are certain similarities in terms of civilians being deliberately targeted. It is really in this period that we're talking about that we're seeing a massive civilianization of armed conflict, which begins in the First World War, which is somewhat ironic because in the previous decades the international community had spent a lot of time and effort to try and codify war, right? To distinguish between civilians and non-civilians. And then 1914 comes and it sort of goes, you know, out of the window. And in this immediate aftermath, we see that civilians are not targeted as byproducts of war. It's the very purpose of the war is to use civilians in order to force them to leave, to create new ethnic realities or religious realities on the ground. So I do think that there is quite a lot in the argument that there is a sort of an element of historical continuity.
Would you like to add to the conversation?
Yeah, I actually wanted to say that for me there is one very important distinction between today's and kind of the period 100 years ago. If we think about the period 100 years ago, we have the war between different governments which overgrew into the civil war. But what we witness now in Ukraine to a certain extent is the opposite. Since Ukraine is at war since 2014, right? Not 24 February 2022. And by all definitions, we can say that that was also a sort of a civil war, right? Because it was the Ukrainian people were fighting against those Ukrainian citizens in those self-proclaimed People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. And now we have a fully fledged invasion of the Russian government. So this is, although I wouldn't say that what we had between 2014 and 2022 was a civil war. There's obviously we have the Russia was supporting those rebels, and obviously there's a lot of kind of influence. But it's still in definition, when we look at legal or whatever framework, we can say that a sort of a civil war overgrew into an international, the war between two governments, and an invasion of one government, one country to Ukraine. So I think this is an important distinction, and how basically, it's changed direction. But again, I don't want to say that there was purely a civil war in Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine is at war with Russia, but how it was framed, it was as if Ukrainians were fighting against those wishing to separate.
I think the boundary between the two positions is about how do we view the Russian Civil War? How do we view it? Was it a national war to create the empire that had been overthrown by the Bolshevik Revolution, to recapture Brest-Litovsk? Was the victory of Bolshevik Russia in the Civil War what Putin is aiming at? The slow reconstruction of his regime as a hegemonic power?
Well, I think, yes, indeed. And when I think about those even left radicals who later joined the Bolshevik government, trying to introduce the change from within, in their rhetoric, in their publications, you see how they define the Bolsheviks as imperialists. They say that they wish to gather all the Russian lands to recreate the Russian Empire. So the narrative was there, right? They saw Russian Bolsheviks as imperialists, as those wishing to take control over all those former imperial provinces. And this is why there was this ideological conflict, right, between Ukrainian non-Bolshevik communists and Russian Bolsheviks. But what we see now is definitely Putin's attempt to recreate not the Soviet Union, but the reference is to the empire, right? And this is why we see that in 2017, the commemoration of the revolution wasn't that big of an event, although you would think, right? This is the 100 years after the October Revolution, which created the Soviet Union and so on. So you would expect a larger impact or the recognition of the impact of the event, but it went almost unnoticed.
I don't know if you've had the pleasure is not the right word, had the experience of visiting the First World War Museum in Tsarskoye Selo. Of course, there you see it. Russia, before the Bolsheviks, had one leader, one army, and one church. It's a narrative of the First World War that I've never seen in any other part of the world, but it's there, and it is after all, you know, where Catherine the Great had her palace and where Anna Akhmatova was born. So it has its echoes in many parts of the world. I think, once again, this is my personal intervention, but I do think, you know, the issue of the parallels between 1919 and today are important, whatever our professional expertise. May I ask you what your view is about the parallels between 1919? We've seen the exhibition; it shows multifaceted possibilities. And today, are you minded that we've gone back to 1919, or is it another time and another place?
There are certainly echoes. When I was thinking about what we might discuss today, I went back and looked at documents from the first Irish government and its hopes for its place in the world. And it says a lot about the League of Nations and hopes for that. And it talks about how it was looking forward to being welcomed by other small nations who had, for the most part, come through this awful time with the great powers. And they did not use derogatory language for anybody, unlike Churchill, as you mentioned at the beginning. And they were looking for solidarity, looking for connection, and feeling like if there was this banding together of colonies or former colonies or powers, countries that had been created in the aftermath of the war, legacies of imperialism, that it could actually lead to world peace. They were very ambitious, and they could play their role in it. And I do think I'm getting that sense. I don't think Ireland is perfect in its response, but I think we are trying, and we are relating on that level that we have past histories of struggling against an aggressive country that's bigger and mightier than us, and that this will only be resolved or move forward from if we have a recognition from other nations of our struggle.
Piotr, I wonder, one thing that struck me in doing some work exactly on this issue of the League of Nations and public health and terrible epidemics in the 1919-22 period, the reception of the Polish people, of the immigrant tide, the tsunami, human tsunami that came out in order to save their lives, has to impress all of us. Do you think there is a sense in which 1919, where the same huge migratory flows Peter Gatrell showed many years ago happened, there's some sense that this is déjà vu, we've been here before, and this time we have to do better?
Oh, it's very difficult to answer such a question, because, first of all, because modern war, it's always the war of images, and you know, this images of today's war and this flood of immigrants, when is created on, let's say, other side, it looks quite different. And in fact, I'd like to say that when I think about this period, 1918, 1921, 2023, I think about images. In this time, it was mainly posters, of course, which was made by sometimes leading artists like Rodchenko, Malevich, and so on, against Poland. Yeah, I mean the Bolshevik war. And coming back to the question about differences between today and this period, 1918, 1923, I would say that the technology of images is really important. For example, what struck me the most, there are images, I would say, unhuman, because abundance and quality and density of the electronic images are so strong and, let's say, even unhuman, because contemporary technology makes our eye to look like a camera on a drone. So we can see the mass of immigrants. We can see the mass of a lot of cars on the border and so on and so on. It makes very strong impression. But contemporary technology is able even to place our eye on the top on the anti-tank missile. So it's, in my view, the main difference between the past conflicts and today's war, which was declared or undeclared by Moscow and Ukraine.
I wonder if, though, the effect of the huge outpouring of photography in the period 1918 to 24, the Anti-War Museum in Berlin, Friedrich's Museum, actually had the capacity to desanctify war. That it happened already, and that's part of the Dada revolution too. That photography showed the ugliness of war, and if we want streams of photographs of refugees, we go to Greece, of the people fleeing Ataturk in well, he wasn't Ataturk yet, Mustafa Kemal in 1922. My view is slightly more sympathetic to the parallel, namely that, this is Susan Sontag's view as well, that already in the 1930s, the sensibility of mass public, think of the photography of the Spanish Civil War, for example, newsreels and its influence on Picasso, has taken the innocence of photography away from war, taken the innocence or the ugliness of war to photography. So what we see on the television screens today, I'm not sure if you would agree, is very similar to what we've already seen in Syria. Not surprising, and Putin did the same thing. I don't know the same about Chechnya, whether there was the same avalanche of photography as there has been for Syria, but I'd take a slightly more, as it were, long-term view of the visualization of what Robert called the civilianization of war. The civilians are the targets. And they are intentional targets. They're not just accidental targets at all.
Yeah, I think you also have already in 1918 lots of photographic images flooding out of Finland, for example. Then, I mean, you mentioned Greece and Turkey in 1922. There are moving images of the burning of Smyrna, taken from one of the battleships anchored in the harbor. They don't have the same, reproduction speed probably, but maybe in terms of impact of actual refugees arriving, that was huge, and I think is often underestimated. I mean, if you think of Berlin in the 1920s has, I think, 40 Russian publishing houses that publish in Russian because there's a huge demand, huge Russian community there. Plus, of course, the numerous Jewish refugees from East Central Europe that are fleeing from pogroms. And I think the impact is very visible. They're very much sort of there. People are conscious of this. It's a topic at the time. So in that sense, it is probably, there are elements of history repeating itself.
Well, I think that in the case of photography, the distance between the subject and the viewer is slightly longer than in the case of electronic image.
There's no distance at all.
Yes, there's no distance.
No, I'm very impressed with that argument and see it perhaps as a bit more of a continuity. But perhaps the final point that we could raise, since we've been here for an hour and 20 minutes, is maybe, Bartosz, you might think of this. If you had to do the exhibition again after the Ukraine-Russian war started, would it look different? Would your interpretation of that period change because the world today's changed? This is what we historians constantly do, adjust our view of the past in order to make sense of the present. The present has changed. Would you have changed it in any way yourself?
Well, it's a difficult question because I wouldn't like to make that history too contemporary.
Why not? I know that's a very. I think that's a very important question, and I know that there's more than one answer to it. But my understanding is ENRS is about that. Is about making the history contemporary. Am I mistaken?
No, but this is more complicated.
Of course.
But I think the irony, I would say, as someone who was involved in the conceptualizations from the start, is that the pandemic and the conflict in Ukraine have made it much more contemporary than we anticipated at first. I mean, without us intending it to be a commentary. So unfortunately, these events have kind of given it a topicality that wasn't really intended, since we're historians, art historians.
Our projects are also for somehow intelligent commentary, can deal as intelligent commentaries of the contemporary situation.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that I would draw more attention to those things that have happened between 2018 and today. So, as I mentioned in my introduction, the presidential elections in Belarus, the using of the flags, I think I would put more attention to these symbols. Plus, then of course, a pandemic that would be much more interesting for people. And yeah, definitely the war in Ukraine, these lessons that we are drawing also from the period 100 years ago. But then I have a question to you as well. Because you're doing research on the League of Nations and the Lausanne Treaty. And that was the period when there were a lot of law regulations. The international law was being developed. Which did not help much, like 15 years later. Nevertheless, it was developed. And now I think that what we're observing is that international law and international organizations, they do not matter, not at all. I mean, everything that is happening, the immense Western help, it's all in fact unofficial. I mean, certain countries are helping, and we know which ones, but it's not under an umbrella of one organization, or it's not because the international law prohibits such wars, it's just because these countries are helping. So, taking into account your research, what are the lessons that we should draw from that period in the near future? For example, next year we have the 100th anniversary of the Lausanne Treaty.
Well, my brief statement is, as war changes, so does peace. Peace is not fixed as a 17th century concept or a 19th century concept. It is constantly in connection with war. And in 1918, the institutions of war mutated. They turned into other forms of violence which were multiple, which is, I think, maybe one of the distinctions that we would make between then and now. But when war moves into forms of violence that are frankly barbaric, in which law has no bearing whatsoever, what we should realize is that peace is not a phenomenon that we know much about. You know, we're historians. We historians know a lot more about war than we do of peace, because it's a phrase that I think has, as you put it, a legal sense, which is a nonsense, meaning that it doesn't have any sense to talk about peace in 1918 to 1921. But how many textbooks still talk about the interwar years as if war, peace, war? And we need to inject, I think, as this exhibition has, a sense of confusion between war and peace, which, frankly, I think is where we are today. I mean, how many years has the war in Syria gone on now? It's a civil war, clearly, but it's not only a civil war. It's many other wars happening at the same time, and it's also barbaric, it's criminal, in which sexual violence happens time and again, as it's happened and probably is happening in Russia. So my answer to you is that the problem with international law is it specifies the notion of peace in an historically inadequate way. So if I've done anything in the book on Lausanne, it's to say that the First World War changed the nature of war and perforce changed the nature of peace.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to invite other comments, please. We've been generous with your time and patience, but I do believe it would help if there are others who would like to join the conversation. There are clear lines of, I think, of shared and of different opinions here, and I'd like to hear others. Yes, please.
Sorry, this isn't from me so much as from our online viewers. Ray O'Leary says, thanks to all involved for this. He goes on to say, it is an excellent and important for Ireland and Irish people to see events here in the wider European context. One point I always make is that we don't realise how lucky we are to be the new, inverted commas, state, the only new state post-1918 to stay both democratic and free of foreign intervention afterwards, up to 1939 and beyond. It is often taken for granted, unfortunately. So I don't know if that's a comment or...
Would you like to?
I tend to agree, and actually one of the things that I stress to my students, and when I've been reflecting on this period of commemoration, is that, well, commemorations are political. So we are deliberately not venturing too far into the civil war in this country. But I think we can be very proud, if we are to reflect on that history, that within 10 years of us being independent, we managed to get over a very bitter and divisive civil war and peacefully hand over power from people who were literally shooting at each other a decade before. And it's done, and we continue on. And that's a very proud moment, and I would agree with the commenter there that it marks us a little bit unusual in the context of small states. But we didn't have we didn't have the experience of those states either, so I would just say that to be fair to the other states.
Well, if you introduce Northern Ireland, the story looks different.
Exactly.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
But I don't for a moment differ from the statement. I think it's a fine way of putting it, but the existence of the unfree 6 counties is something that may end in the violence that existed and to a degree still exists. Would you see that as a failure of Irish reunification?
I think most people do. Yes.
That's the
too much faith was put in, and perhaps because of the Versailles negotiations, that something would be sorted out by the Boundary Commission, and we don't need to talk about that much now. So in the debates on the treaty, Northern Ireland shamefully features a tiny amount of the debates, because there was just this idea we'd fix that. And somehow, quite arrogantly, I think that we would somehow convince unionists that it was absolutely fine to be in a united country, which we didn't, and we haven't yet. And so this is a living and very live history.
Good. Well, I think it's my job to thank the participants in this.
I think there was one more.
Oh, there is one more. If there was, please, I'd be delighted. Forgive me, my eyesight is hopefully less
very much. It's more a comment in terms of what you said about the fact that there was no peace between obviously 1918 and 1939. I completely agree. But in terms of what our own President of Ireland has stated in terms of ethical remembering, particularly in terms of nationalism versus imperialism, and that dirty word in Irish history, partition, which is still an extremely live issue on a territory the size of a rock compared to the rest of the European continent. All I can say is, having listened to Bartos's beautiful introduction to his exhibition earlier, and his wonderful image of the men in the room, the experts in the room afterwards carving up the map of Europe, obviously those experts got it dreadfully wrong in terms of partition. And I say that in the widest sense, in terms of the nation states that developed. And the great project of the European Union, which I think is in major jeopardy, is the fact that the equality of nations was so central in terms of the small and the great. And that's something we still need to cling on to. But I suppose my point is the trauma, particularly in terms of the Irish context, where you had people shell-shocked coming in under the Crown forces, and obviously the initiation of what became the Irish War of Independence. And I suppose how did that happen? How did that play out in other parts of Eastern and Central Europe? The trauma of the imperial system post-1918 when it comes to these civil conflicts throughout the central and eastern part, and how that's not really kind of holistically told, and I think this exhibition attempts to do that. But I think there just needs to be more about it, I suppose, the trauma.
Indeed. Well, that is the word I think we can all accept as a starting point. How, and in many ways, what is astonishing is, given the nature of the trauma of the First World War, how many people came out of it as recognizable human beings. I'm entirely supportive of your view. Yes, there's an additional comment, I believe.
Very interesting discussion. I'm particularly taken by your last comments in relation to peace, and I would be very interested to know your comment analysis on the viability of peace in Ireland post-1998, should I say. Thank you.
My view of the I'd say the importance of the term, the peace process, is that it has to be generational rather than political. Political is, a week is a long time in politics, maybe several years is an eon in politics, but the notion that children can grow up with the idea that violence is odd, is strange, is something different, as opposed to growing up with the idea that violence is normal, and that when you see those astonishing portraits in Belfast on the Divide, when I think about the way in which Sands died of starvation, and he's glorified in Belfast to this day, I wonder whether there is still a notion that violence is honorable. And for that to go, it'll take generations. It's not just something that can be done. So 1898 seems to me to be just yesterday. Is that a fair way of summarizing it, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very broad canvas of a question. Yes. I'm just taken by your finishing comments about peace. In a way is an ever-evolving concept, that it's not fixed. And I suppose since 1998, now I was born in '69, so I grew up, all I heard on the news was about the Troubles. You were normalization, exactly, of what you said in terms of our lives. But of course, the generation has grown up since then that hasn't experienced that. But I think that, there would be a lot of concern that the peace that was secured in '98 is volatile. To the point that, is it sustainable? Is it going to change? There's a lot of rhetoric, harsh rhetoric out there at the moment. So I was just wondering, did you, because, I know this is we're talking about a new Europe, 1918-23, but nonetheless, in this part of Europe, peace is still fragile.
Well, I'd go a step further. My view is that Putin has made war on the whole of Europe. He hasn't just made war on Ukraine. It's a much bigger challenge because here is a violent campaign that will determine what peace means in the future. Only through his defeat can the word peace have, I think, a substance attached to it. If in some way he wins, and who knows what that might be, then I think once again, war changes and peace changes. If he is defeated and it is the Russian people who will ultimately make that decision, then I would say that there's a good chance that the word peace that is embedded in the European movement has a chance of survival. I'm just speaking. Robert, do you want to add to that, perhaps?
No, I mean, I agree with you. Of course, with the Good Friday Agreement, there was at the time, I think it was quite rightly greeted as one of the very few peaceful resolutions of a civil war, which, the troubles were, it's a euphemistic term used for a low-intensity civil war. And then, of course, Brexit kind of unraveled it. I think my impression as someone who's not Irish, has been living in Ireland for the last 15 years, is that that was a situation with which everyone could live quite happily, depending on, if you felt British, then you were British. If you were Irish, you were Irish. There was no border. And that sort of, that is in danger right now, and it's not quite clear for what, but so we're looking at a very different situation. But I think we should remind ourselves people have been thinking about how to avoid inter-ethnic conflict since the end of the First World War, when the unraveling of mixed, ethnically mixed empires started. And the alternatives are not looking great, because we talked about partitions earlier on, which were of course introduced as a means to separate communities. It was intended as a way of avoiding civil war, and that didn't work out. And then in the case of Greece, they came to the suggestion, well, then we have to expel them all. We have to make sure that they don't live together. And that's obviously not a great option either. And the third sort of model was the minorities treaties, probably the best thing to have come out of the Paris Peace Conference. But the states didn't really want that. So in some ways we have to return to, I think, a conversation which includes failed attempts to prevent civil war from happening. And I think that, in all the basic principles, the Good Friday's Agreement was a great, probably the best sort of peace agreement of the 20th century.
Well, on that note, I think we have reached the time set for this conversation to be concluded. And let me ask you to show in the usual way your thanks to the participants in this roundtable.
Please give me a chance to say two sentences. I think it is, well, not the best, but for sure one of the best discussions which we ever made. Thank you very much for that, to all of you, and especially to you, Professor J. Winter. Thank you very much.